Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You may be seated. Well, in case you haven't heard yet, let me be the first to tell you, political elections are coming. You probably didn't know. Now, political elections, that means we can expect the 3 C's are also coming. Campaigns and candidates and commercials. Endless commercials. So for the next year and roughly a half, we're going to be bombarded with thousands of speeches and debates and interviews with various candidates. There will be tens of thousands of promises made to us, assuring us that if we will vote for a particular candidate, all of our problems will be solved and our lives will be better if we simply support a particular candidate. Now, I've been doing this a long time, and so I think my calculations are correct. If they are correct, in the next year and a half, we will experience enough hot air to completely fuel Albuquerque's annual balloon festival for 3 years. I think my calculations are correct. So, political season is upon us here. What political leaders should we elect? What kind of leaders should we support and follow? A little deeper level, what are the essential qualities we should demand and require of our leaders? What are those essential internal qualities that we should not compromise on, that we should demand, we should require our leaders to practice in their leadership? What are those? Well, welcome back to Wise Guys. This summer we are looking into the lives of significant Old Testament characters who demonstrated in their lives a measure of wisdom. That's why we're calling them Wise Guys. Now, again, let me remind you, these are not perfect people. They are normal people just like you and me, but their stories are told in the Bible and particular episodes are told to give us an example of what wisdom should look like. And so we're looking at these episodes in their lives, trying to pick up, okay, what does it take to be a wise person and to make wise decisions? All right, now today, I'll just be honest with you. We are going to look at a very unlikely candidate for wise guy status. From the get-go, the guy we're going to look at today, he has 2 strikes against him. Number 1, he's a politician. Okay? And then number 2, he's not a believer. He's not a believer in God. Now you may be wondering, how could anything wise come from that combination? You may even at this point be doubting my own wisdom for nominating this guy for wise guy status. Believe it or not, we're going to learn today from the Pharaoh of Egypt, of all people, what it takes to be a wise guy. All right, now here's the backstory on the Pharaoh of Egypt. Joseph, who is the main character in the last half of the book of Genesis, is down in Egypt because his jealous brothers sold him into slavery. When you get to the end of Genesis chapter 40, Joseph is in prison, unjustly accused of trying to do the mess around with Potiphar's wife. You guys remember that story. So he unjustly accused in prison. Suddenly, everything changes when the Pharaoh of Egypt has a couple of strange dreams. Now let's pick up the story at Genesis 41, verse 1, and we're gonna learn some things about being a wise guy when it comes to making wise rulings and the kind of political leaders who are making rulings and decisions every day that affect our lives. We're going to learn today who are the wise leaders that we need to elect and then get behind and follow. All right, are you ready? Let's get going. Number one, the first quality, follow leaders who are teachable. Learn to follow leaders who are teachable. In other words, we don't need leaders who are know-it-alls. You know, they're God's gift to humanity. No, we need men and women who are leaders who have a teachable spirit. I love the first part of this story. Genesis 41, verse 1. When 2 full years had passed, that is 2 full years of Joseph being in jail, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again, and he had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled. Wouldn't you be if you had a couple of dreams like that? So he sent for all of the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Now each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard." By the way, who is that? Joseph. Yeah, that's the Hebrew, okay, in prison with these guys. Now we told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Now you gotta love Joseph's answer. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Isn't that a great line? God can do it. All right, let's stop for a moment there. Political leaders. Do you know that political leaders today are actually coached to never say these words, "I don't know"? They're coached to never say those words, "I don't know," because it makes them look weak and it makes them look uninformed. Now, God, this is not good leadership. This is arrogance. This is pride, thinking that you're going to know everything. And so political leaders today are coached, if you are ever asked a question and you have no idea of the answer, here's how you do it. You just change the subject. And you just answer a question that the person didn't ask. And they are trained to not answer the question asked, but to actually go toward a talking point that they have rehearsed over and over and over again. That's how they're trained to do it. Bad leadership, guys, bad leadership. What's the wise leader do? In your notes, boy, let's get this down. The wise leader, the leader worth following, is not afraid to say, "I don't know all the answers. I don't know all the answers, but I will find someone who does." Do you realize at this point in the story, Pharaoh he couldn't figure out the interpretation of his dream. But do you realize he could very arrogantly said, I have no idea what these dreams are about, but I can't let anybody know. Because if somebody finds out that I had a dream and I can't interpret it, they will interpret that as being weak and uninformed. Man, I got to keep my dream under the sheets, no pun intended. I can't let this thing out. He could have done that. Now, listen carefully. Had Pharaoh taken that path, as we will see later in the story, the consequences would have been disastrous. Totally disastrous. You see, good leaders ask great questions. It just so happens that I have a book up here, and the title is Good Leaders Ask Great Questions. John Maxwell wrote the book. He's one of my favorite writers. He is a leader of leaders. As a matter of fact, John Maxwell is now considered the premier leader of leaders in the world. His leadership books and materials and resources are taught to millions of people all around the world. The great leader of leaders. And he writes a book later in his life called Good Leaders Ask Great Questions. Notice the title is not Good Leaders Know All the Answers. No. John Maxwell knows to be a great leader, you're not going to be a know-it-all. You've got to learn to ask great questions. Now, I put a quote from the book in your notes. I didn't have room to put the whole quote, so let me give you the whole quote. John Maxwell, Good Leaders Ask Great Questions. He says this, questions. For 40 years, I've asked questions on the subject of leadership. Now, you might think as time has gone by, and I've received thousands of answers, that questions have become less important to me. But the opposite is true. The more questions I ask, the more valuable I recognize them to be. Without the wise counsel and insightful answers I've received to questions over the decades, I wonder where I would be today. What an insight. Guys, from the great leader, John Maxwell, who has written more books than I think I have even read, his principles taught all over the world, in the business world, political world, religious world, educational world. He says, you never become a the minute you become a know-it-all, you become a bad leader. Great leaders keep asking great questions. So, political season's upon us. We've got to decide in the next year and a half who we're going to vote for. Who are we going to vote for? Let's make sure that we find leaders who are teachable. They're not know-it-alls, but they have a teachable attitude. All right, number 2. The second principle we're looking for in leaders, follow leaders who are humble. Follow leaders who are humble. Yeah, you might have trouble finding one of these because they tend to be know-it-alls. Let's pick up the story. Verse 17. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. And after them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I've never seen such ugly cows in the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. Now the thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. Now I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me. Let's stop there for a moment. Leaders are humble. Now, I don't want you to miss the audacity of this scene in the narrative. Now, think about it. The Pharaoh of Egypt, okay? Big dog, big man over everything. In Egypt, he's worshiped as a god. The Pharaoh of Egypt is seeking counsel from a prisoner who's from a foreign land on the recommendation of a cupbearer. Do you see the audacity of this scene? Let me make this contemporary. This would be like a president of the United States seeking counsel from a convict based on a recommendation from a guy who works in the kitchen at the White House. That's what we're looking at here. You know what you call that? Humility. An arrogant, proud leader would never stoop to receive counsel from a convict based upon a recommendation from a guy who works in the kitchen. Wouldn't happen. Humility. Interestingly enough, humility has always been rated high in God's book for a successful leader. Now here's the kicker. Did you know that in recent years, scientific research has proven the same? That great leaders are humble leaders. It's true. A number of research studies have shown in recent years that the most successful leaders in business, and for that matter in other fields, are guided by an attitude of humility. All right, let me show you another book. This book here is called The Leadership Challenge, written by James Kouzes and Barry Posner. The way I found out about the Leadership Challenge book is I kept hearing John Maxwell refer to this book. John Maxwell kept saying over and over again in all of his books that I'm reading that the Leadership Challenge is the greatest book ever written on leadership. As a matter of fact, John Maxwell called this book the Bible of leadership. So I had to go get it. And I read this book, and guess what I learned? This is the best book on leadership ever written. Maxwell is right. The best book I've ever written. The leadership principles here apply to political leaders, business leaders, educational leaders, church leaders. You name it, it doesn't matter. Unbelievable research all around the world, and what these guys were looking for is what makes great leaders. All right? Again, I didn't have time to put the entire quote in your notes, so let me read to you the entire note from Kouzes and Posner, The Leadership Challenge. Now, this blew my mind when I read this paragraph. Here it is. Humility is the antidote for hubris. Hubris is pride or arrogance. You can avoid excessive pride only when you recognize that you're human and you need the help of others. Exemplary leaders know that, quote, you can't do it alone, and they act accordingly. Now, this next one really got me, and I put this in your notes. The word human and the word humble both derive from the Latin humus, meaning earth. To be human and humble is to be down to earth with your feet firmly planted on the ground. Isn't that amazing? After years and years of research, literally around the world, looking for what makes a leader great, they discovered one of the uncompromising principles is humility. Isn't that amazing? You know what's really amazing? The Bible's been teaching this for thousands of years. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the... You've read that. These guys discovered what the Bible has taught, that great leaders are humble leaders. You know, a third book that I've really enjoyed over the years, some of you in the room have read Good to Great, Jim Collins. Mary and I and John and Sharon had wonderful privilege a couple of summers ago of spending 2 or 3 days in a room with about 50 people with Jim Collins. Man, John Sharon, I'll never forget that experience as long as I live. What an experience we had. And he would teach and do Q&A, and it was great. And many of you have read this book. What Jim Collins and his team of researchers did is they analyzed the great successful companies. And they asked a simple question: what makes the leaders of these great companies great leaders? Because they knew they would not be great companies without great leaders. And so they developed this tier system. And level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5. Level 5 leaders are the top leaders, okay? Now, as Jim Collins and his research team spent thousands and thousands of hours researching men and women who were the great leaders of the successful companies in the world, guess what they found out? Here it is. The top level, the level 5 leader, is the leader who, quote, builds enduring greatness through a paradoxical blend of personal humility and professional will. Now, do you see that? Personal humility, professional will. Professional will was they've got the drive to get it done. They're workers, they focus in, they get the job done, but they never cross the line and become arrogant and proud. They have that professional will joined with personal humility. Isn't that amazing? Again, 3 of the greatest books ever written on leadership to a secular market are simply discovering and confirming what the Bible has been teaching us for years, that great leaders are humble leaders. So in your notes, let's get this down. Humility in a leader is a sign of secure strength, not impotent weakness. Leaders worth following are humble. All right, now there is a third quality we learned from old Pharaoh of Egypt. Boy, I almost broke out into Pharaoh, but I'm not going to do that. Whoa, let my people go. I say I got to quit, or I'm going to sing that song all week. Number 3, follow leaders who are discerning. Follow leaders who are discerning. Now, I got to tell you, I almost used the word courageous. So if you like parentheses, out beside discerning, put courageous. And you'll see why in just a moment. Verse 25, let's continue the story. Oh, I love this section. Then Joseph says to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh, this is the interpretation, okay? The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man. A what? A discerning and wise man, and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. Now this food should be held in reserve for the country. to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. Now, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to his officials. So Pharaoh, I love this line. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this guy? It's just where he points at Joseph. Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Now remember, Pharaoh is a secular guy who doesn't even believe in God, and he sees God working in Joseph's life. Amazing. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You, Joseph, shall be put in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Whoa, what a turn of events. You know, there's an old expression, it takes one to know one. You've heard it. How was Pharaoh able to recognize that Joseph was the discerning and wise man and would be the perfect leader for that job? How did Pharaoh know that? Takes one to know one. Pharaoh himself was a discerning and wise leader. So when he saw one in his presence, he said, there's the guy. I know one when I see one. He's the guy. Now, I talked to you, I said, you know, we could have put the word courageous there, all right? All right, let's fill in this next blank, and I'll explain why. The last thing, guys, oh my, the last thing we need today is more wishy-washy leaders who lick their finger and put it to the politically correct wind of our fickle culture. That is the last thing we need in our country. Can we all agree we got enough of them? We got a quota. We got a quota on fickle leaders who lick their finger to the politically, I got to do what's politically correct, not what's right, not what's wrong. No, it's what's politically correct. Guys, our world today is crying out for leaders who will lead with decisiveness and with clarity. We desperately need leaders who will make the wise and discerning decision, even if it's not popular, even if people don't understand. You think people in Egypt were going to understand when the Pharaoh for 7 years, man, everything is growing like crazy? You think those people understood and applauded Pharaoh when he started taking large percentages of their crops and saving it? It's like, hey, what are you taking all our food for? Well, 7 bad years are coming. Oh yeah, how do you know? Well, this prisoner told me. Well, how did you find out about him? Well, a cook told me. Really? You know what that's called? Discerning, courageous leadership. I love this expression. I put it in your notes. The conductor of the orchestra must be willing to turn his back to the crowd. You want to lead the orchestra, you got to turn your back to the crowd. You want to be a leader, you got to turn your back to the fickle crowd. You got to do what's right. You got to know what's right. You got to be willing to be courageous and do the right job. Leaders worth following are discerning. Hey guys, elections are upon us here. What kind of leaders are we going to follow? Let's make sure we get leaders who are discerning and wise, and then they have the courage to stand up and do what's right. All right, now we're at the bottom line. Here's my question, guys. Did Pharaoh's willingness to be teachable, humble, and discerning pay off in the end? Did it pay off in the end? Let's read the rest of the story. Here it is, verse 53. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. Boy, don't you love that? Do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, see, not just Egypt, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. So, did Pharaoh's willingness to be teachable, humble, and discerning pay off in the end? Absolutely. Do you realize that Pharaoh's wise ruling paid huge dividends, saving the lives of literally, guys, listen, millions and millions of citizens, not only in his country, but in countries surrounding. So, election season is upon us. Who will earn your vote? I didn't say who will buy your vote. Who will earn your vote in the next election? What kind of leaders will you follow in the future? I would encourage and I would challenge you to seek out leaders who have the leadership qualities we just witnessed in the Pharaoh of Egypt. Find and follow leaders who are teachable, who are humble, and who are discerning. You follow leaders like that, who knows? You could end up being a wise guy yourself. Let's pray. Well, Father, thank you for this unlikely character named Pharaoh to be a wise guy. Thank you that Joseph influenced and impacted him in your name. And thank you that he was wise enough to be teachable, humble, and discerning. God, for the leaders in the room, may we follow suit. And Lord, for the leaders we elect in the future, may they demonstrate these biblical qualities in their lives so that when we find these leaders, we will know who to follow. And we'll do it all, Lord, for your praise and your glory through Christ our Lord. Amen.